Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. The dominant news story for the past 2 weeks has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Millions of women and children have fled the fighting. The men have stayed behind to fight. Support for Ukraine has come from countries all over the world. Why is this happening, and where does it all end up? My guest is a Kingston native whose parents immigrated from Ukraine. Obviously, he has an emotional attachment to his ancestral home, but his passion has been the study of Ukraine and the surrounding geography, making it his life's work. Lubomyr Luciuk is an author and professor at RMC, and I invited him to guest in this extended episode to try to help us understand what's going on. This episode was recorded March 10th, 2022, and here is that conversation. Lubomyr, welcome, and thank you very much for joining the podcast.
My pleasure, Dave. Thank you for having me.
The media has kept you very busy over the last few weeks, seeking to get a better understanding of what's happening in Ukraine. And I know you have an emotional attachment to the country, but it's also your life's work. You do research, you teach at RMC, you've written books on the topic. Can we start with a bit of an overview? And what I'm looking to get from you is a sense as to why there has been so much emotional support around the world for Ukraine over these past couple of weeks.
Okay, David. Well, basically, I became involved in the study of things Ukrainian Canadian, because of my heritage. My parents came to Kingston, Ontario as political refugees, as so-called displaced persons after the Second World War. They got here in 1949. You can see it behind me. There's a glass case, and in that case is the one piece of luggage they brought with them. That's all they had. I see it every day that I come into my office, and it reminds me of how welcoming Canada was, how grateful my parents were to Canada for giving them asylum, and how that opportunity led to my success in life, I suppose, becoming a professor, my sister becoming a school principal. Both of us did well and contributed in part because, as I say, Canada welcomed the refugees. So when I was growing up in Kingston, a very small Ukrainian community here, even smaller now, I was raised in a milieu where people talked about the Second World War. They talked about the genocidal Great Famine of 1932-33 in Soviet Ukraine, the Holodomor as it's now known. They talked about the experience of being slave laborers in the Third Reich. They talked about resistance to the Nazis, resistance to the Soviets. They talked about the refugee experience. So all of that was sort of, the common coin of conversations in our small parish, St. Michael's Ukrainian Catholic Parish. I was raised in it, but because it was a very small community, interestingly enough, I was exposed to a range of different views and opinions and experiences growing up. So my godmother was a survivor of the famine, so I heard about the famine. Mr. Chishuk was a member of the Ukrainian insurgent army in Volyn, so he would tell me about those stories. Other people had served in the underground of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, so I heard those stories. And there were factions in that OUN. I heard from both sides. And some people had been gathered up, like my mother, and ended up as slave laborers in Germany. So, what was that experience like, being a teenager and forced to leave your family behind forever? I heard all of that. It was at times almost, frankly, overwhelming. And I know that in our small community, there were other young men and women my age, young adults who found it too much and, in a sense, left the community because it was, quote unquote, too political. It was the stuff you always heard about. One day there'll be a free Ukraine. We suffered this. We experienced that. Look what they did here. Look what those guys did to us over there. So there was that very intense pressure on us to continue being engaged with the notion that one day there should be a free Ukraine. And it was a pressure. I must admit that for a while I left it too, believe it or not. I wanted to be a biologist. And before that, I wanted to be a cement truck driver, but that I failed in both those fields. It wasn't really until I got to Queen's University for my first degree at the bachelor's level, BSc, that starting in biology, I drifted toward geography, physical geography. And then as a result of my encounter with two men in particular, or three, I should say, three people in particular at Queen's in the geography department, Dick Ruggles, who taught a course on Soviet geography, Alistair Taylor, who taught courses in political geography. They're both now deceased, unfortunately. And my good friend still to this day, Peter Goheen, who taught me historical geography. Those three men inspired me to really sort of rethink whether I wanted to be a biologist or perhaps get more involved in what I came to study, the political geography and the political history of Ukraine in the 20th century and of Ukrainians in Canada. I went on then to the University of Alberta and did a PhD under Leszek Puszyński, who's again still a good friend, a population geographer, came back to the University of Toronto, taught there for a while, came back to Queen's, taught there for a while in various postdocs, and then in 1990 got over to RMC. And a wonderful place that I'm still connected to, and very much am grateful for what RMC has allowed me to do over the decades. So the study of Ukraine became something that I got drawn into somewhat because of my background, but also something I came back to after having kind of left it for a while. What I found originally, and I remember this very well, my mother had this very good habit of every Saturday taking me down to the Kingston Public Library. So when I was a boy, I was allowed to read anything. There was absolutely no censorship. It was remarkable when I think about it. I would go down to the library with her. We'd walk down from Nelson Street. The library used to be down near where the post office is, the main post office, part of the hospital now. And I was allowed to choose any books. Could be fiction, could be history, could be biography, could be geography, anything. There was absolutely no restriction, but there was a condition. I could take as many books on whatever I wanted to read, but I had to have them read by that following Saturday.
Really?
And yeah, and that was almost a religion with my mother. But I needed more. I would hear from people, there is no Ukraine. People say that to me. There's no such thing as Ukrainians. You're Russians. You're little Russians. Or they'd say, well, where is Ukraine? And, it would be hard to find on an atlas because it was part of the Soviet Union. And you didn't want to talk about, we're Soviets. So I grew up in a world where one of the things that frustrated me and which I swore I would change would be to find more books in English about Ukraine. And so as of today, 2022, I've either written, edited, co-edited, co-authored 31 books. And on topics ranging from Canada's first national internment operations and in World War I, the War Measures Act, and how Ukrainians were rounded up as enemy aliens, starting here in Kingston. In fact, Fort Henry was the first permanent internment camp. I'm the guy that started that campaign that eventually, after almost a quarter of a century, resulted in the government of Canada acknowledging what had happened and establishing a commemorative and educational fund. So proud of that. I looked at the history of Ukrainians in Canada. I looked at the history of Ukrainians serving overseas in the Second World War and helping rescue the refugees, including my parents. So I honored them and commemorated them, and literally this morning was working on a project that will continue that into 2022 in Europe. A whole range of kinds of things, history of Ukrainians in Kingston, documentary collections about things like the famine, the Holy See and the Holodomor, documents from the British Foreign Office. All of these things were projects that I decided were important, that there had to be information in English for a broader audience. And, I realize that today in our 21st century, perhaps there are people who go, well, I don't, it's not online, I can't read it. That's a big mistake because you can search on the net and find all sorts of stuff. But if you go into the stacks of a library and you're, say, interested in Ukrainians in Kingston, let's just pick that as a topic because where we are, you'll find my book, but you'll find other books about Ukrainians, perhaps in Ontario, on the same shelf, which you might not find if you're just scanning online. So if you actually go into the stacks and look at the stacks, you'll find books that are related to that theme, and then you can build out from it. It's a technique and a tool that I think students really need to develop, and they've lost that to some degree. And I see it in papers when students rely on the internet for their research. Anyway, so that was one of the things I set out to do, was to study and write and publish books about things Ukrainian, Canadian, Ukrainian. And I'm pleased with what I've done. I've got 3 or 4 more in the can, as it were, that I'm working on. So I'm hoping that by the time I retire in a few years, I'll have had 34, 35 books done. And the next big one after that is my memoirs. I've kept a diary since I went to graduate school. So it's 132, 33 volumes now. I've been going through it and excerpting the pieces that I wrote about things having to do with the political life of Ukrainians in Canada. Not my personal stuff. Nobody cares about that. But it's the sort of people I've met and the activities I've engaged in and the initiatives that I launched and projects I've been involved in and the people I met along the way, everyone from the late John Sapinka on the Supreme Court to people like John Gregorovich, who headed up the Civil Liberties Commission, leaders of the Ukrainian dissident movement, veterans of various formations. I mean, I've had this remarkable, I have to say, not toot my own horn here, I've been so bloody lucky to have had a life where I've met so many interesting people, and sometimes I scribble a few lines, sometimes I scribble a few pages, and now I'm looking at it from the perspective of an old man, and I'm going back and I'm going, wow, there's some really interesting stuff in here I'd forgotten. I mean, one of my great friends when I was still doing my PhD was a guy by the name of Andriy Bandera. He was the son of the assassinated leader of the Ukrainian nationalist movement called Stepan Bandera. And so Andriy was a great guy to talk to. He of course known his father, and I could sort of touch that part of history just through him. But more importantly, he was a guy that encouraged me to write for the newspapers. So he was a newspaper editor. And so he said, Lubomyr, you've got a bit of a talent as a writer. You should try writing. And he encouraged me, and he published some of my stuff. And again, I was a pup those days. I mean, I don't know, in my 20s, but he ran Ukrainian Echo, an English language newspaper in Toronto. And he said, I'll publish some of your stuff. And then he'd edit it and he'd show me what I did wrong. And he'd say, here's how you write a good op-ed. Here's how you make it punchy. And here's how you stay on topic. And well, to date now, I've probably had 250 published. And that's because of people like him.
A couple of questions about the political history of all of this. I think some people still have the thought that Ukraine's independence goes back to the breakup of the Soviet Union, but Ukraine was a separate country long before that, correct?
Sure. Yes. So if the first bit of myth is that Ukrainians and Russians are the same. They're not. Obviously, they have a history that is connected. This history goes back to, medieval times of Mongol invasions. The people of Kievan Rus, the people of Kievan Rus were this medieval principality that had links across Europe. But again, when you hear me say it, Kievan Rus, that's not the Rossiya, it's the Rus. That kingdom was destroyed, broken into parts. Muscovy eventually emerged and became what we know as modern Russia and abrogated to itself the history of Kievan Rus. So you hear Russians sometimes say Kiev is the mother of Russian cities. Well, no, it might be called the mother of Rus cities. That's not unfair, but it's not Russia. Muscovy or Moscow didn't even exist when Kiev was a medieval principality with ties to Constantinople, ties to France, and so on. The languages are different. The historical experiences are different. Ukrainians are simply put not Russians. Now, they have had a long history of being subjugated by the Russians, by the Poles, by the Mongols, by the Germans, by the Soviets, the Russians, the whole 9 yards. They've had, a very troubled history in that regard. Ukraine is a very rich country, both in its natural resources and in its ability to grow food. For example, the breadbasket of Europe, it's often been referred to from ancient Greek times. And so it's been coveted by its neighbors. It's been dismembered by its neighbors, but there have been repeated efforts to declare independence and maintain it. Yes, in 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you saw the emergence of an independent Ukraine. I remember very well getting an atlas in 1990 from my parents for Christmas, or 1991, I'm sorry. And there it was. It was the first time I'd actually seen in an atlas, I think Rand McNally or maybe National Geographic, I forget which one it was, but I open it and there's a 2-page spread, Ukraine, on its own. And again, I have that atlas back there somewhere. I mean, it was like, wow. So it appeared on the maps of the world. And what's important here, Dave, is, and you just said it, you know, we can argue about Kievan Rus, is that Russia, is that Ukraine, blah, blah, blah. Nobody argues that Spanish and Portuguese are the same people, right? But they obviously have common roots. You can talk about Latin Europe. You can talk about, you know, the Roman influence in the West as opposed to the Byzantine influence in the East, and the historic and religious stuff. Oh, that's fine. It's interesting and it's true. But these are distinct nations, very distinct now. The languages overlap to some degree, 60% or something, but so does English and Dutch, right? So nobody's going to tell me that the Dutch are English or the English are Dutch. So why would they say it for Ukrainians? Well, because it's lazy thinking. It was the Soviet Union. It was dominated by the Russians. It's a very large nationality. And of course, it came, the lingua franca of the Russian Empire and then of the Soviet Union was Russian. If you were coming from Kazakhstan or from Kalmykia or from Tatarstan or from Georgia or Ukraine, the language of common use was Russian. Makes perfect sense. I grew up speaking Ukrainian. That was my mother tongue. But what language am I using now, right? English. So that's normal. Language doesn't necessarily identify political identity. It isn't the sole characteristic that sets people apart. So Ukrainians are not Russians. Russians aren't Ukrainians. What's really neat, though, and I think this is what your listeners might want to hear, is that when Ukraine becomes independent in 1991, that's now 31 years ago. So we have an entire generation of people in their 20s and early 30s who never knew the Soviet Union, never experienced it. They were born in a free Ukraine. And they're a very, very different individual from pre-1991. So how do I know this? There's been an officer exchange program at Fort Frontenac. For many years, we would have Ukrainian officers arriving to study at Fort Frontenac. Pretty intense programs lasting several months. And as a civilian host, I was invited to meet with them and you know, show them around town, be as a kind of a local contact person. I happily did it. Post 1991, when this began, actually the first ones probably came around 2000. I met every one of them. And every one of them was patriotic. Every one of them was, you know, a proficient officer. Some of those people are fighting on the front lines against Russian aggression right now. But the mentality was still Soviet. Absolutely. You saw it in the way they behaved and the way they reacted to encountering a Ukrainian in Canada and so on. However, just before COVID, COVID really knocked everything off the plate. But for the last 2 years before COVID hit, I got 2 young men who came, who were both post-1991, they were in their late 20s, had served on the Eastern Front, defending Ukraine against Russian aggression, which began not just February 24th, 2022. Ukrainians have been fighting a war for 8 years now. It started in 2014 after the revolution of dignity in the Euromaidan. Anyway, these were people who'd fought on the Eastern Front. These were people who were very different in their psyche from the ones I'd met before. These were people who were absolutely committed to Ukraine staying in Europe, returning to its rightful place in Europe, away from Moscow is a kind of a slogan, if you like, that they would have used. These were real patriots and prepared to fight for it and professional at it. So that's why when you see Mr. Putin's aggression against Ukraine, I mean, frankly, he's a fascist. The KGB clown in the Kremlin, as I usually refer to him. This corrupt, venal billionaire, this KGB man whose grandfather served Stalin as a Chekist and whose father was in the KGB. I mean, he is not a communist. He's very self-centered, very self-interested. He is corrupt. And he's launched a war, and he thought everybody there in Ukraine was just like him, because he and I are the same age. So if you like, I mean, I'm not a billionaire, trust me, but I don't even think I'm corrupt, because nobody ever offered me any money to do anything, which has been one of the great sort of tragedies of my life. How come everybody else is getting bought? But all kidding aside, the reality of it is Putin is my age, and I look at him and I go, that is a typical Soviet man. He doesn't necessarily believe in the Soviet ideology or communism, but he has this notion that people are kind of going to just roll over. And what he's encountered, or what his troops, his conscripts have encountered, the 19, 20-year-olds that he's sending into Ukraine right now, are coming up against 25, 30-year-olds who've got combat experience and are fighting for their homes, are fighting for their country. And, I don't know how the battlefield will turn out in the long run for Ukraine, but in these first 2 weeks, the Russians have been slaughtered. I mean, it's tragic that many Ukrainian civilians have been murdered by the invaders. I had some very disturbing news from Ukraine 2 days ago. Ironically, on International Women's Day, I got a credible report of Russian troops not only raping Ukrainian women, but then executing them by hanging them in a town just outside of Kharkiv. This is not going to be forgiven, and this is not going to be forgotten. Yeah. So even if some of your listeners were to say, well, Ukrainians and Russians, they're like kissing cousins, well, I suppose I could say the same about the Israelis and their neighbors. They're all cousins, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're happy with each other. But what certainly happened is that following the invasion of Crimea and its illegal occupation in February and March of 2014, and then the attacks by Russian troops masquerading as separatists in eastern Ukraine, and now the full-blown invasion that's occurred as of 24th of February 2022, Ukraine and Russia are forever apart. Not only has the so-called Russian Federation become an international pariah, and I think all your listeners, viewers will know that, but there's been such an egregious, unprovoked strike made against the entire Ukraine. And remember, this is a country that's larger than France. We're talking about a big place. Yeah. That, you might have argued 20 years ago, well, nationalists in Ukraine are all in the West. People like my parents, they're the nationalists. But central Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, these are Russian-speaking people. They're quite comfortable with the people next door, the big neighbor next door. Ukrainians are just little Russians, blah, blah, blah. I heard a lot. They speak Russian, so therefore they must be sympathetic to Russia. Well, if they ever were, and certainly there was some of that, there's no doubt about it. I mean, they're neighbors. But now, forget it. Kharkiv, where I remember being laughed at because I spoke Ukrainian at the front desk of a hotel, where normally people, when you're checking into a hotel, they don't laugh at you. They want your money. They want your custom. But there, I remember, people going, yeah, who are you? We speak Russian around here. Well, look at Kharkiv. Kharkiv still hasn't given up. Kharkiv is fighting. It's a Russophone city that is fighting people are refusing to give up. And this is, I think, evidence. All the evidence you need now of Ukrainian resistance is before us in every daily broadcast you listen to, turn on the TV, BBC, Al Jazeera, whatever you want. Ukrainians are fighting everywhere, and they will never forget this. And the 2.2 million Ukrainians who've been forced to flee west into Poland and Romania and Moldova and Hungary and Slovakia, and God thank all those countries for their generosity in welcoming these people. Do you think those people are going to forget what happened to them or to their loved ones? These are mainly older people, women, and children, because the men folk are standing firm and fighting. So there's going to be a lot of widows, and there's going to be a lot of children who grow up without fathers or uncles or brothers. And those people are going to say, we will never forget. I remember growing up in a world where never forget was the slogan. Well, yeah, this will never be forgotten. The atrocities, the war crimes, the fact that this is a war of aggression. I mean, Mr. Putin certainly belongs in the dock at The Hague, the International Court of Justice, for the war criminal he is. Whether he's ever brought there, I don't know, but I wrote that back in June of last year. Already it was clear. Now, I mean, this has become this is apocalypse now. We're watching it. We're watching the Third World War. It's just that I think most people in the West haven't figured that out yet.
I think a lot of people have been following what's been going on in Ukraine, watching reports on television, and I guess it depends upon which station or network you are monitoring to get some sense as to what's happening. And I'd just like to get your take on a few of the items that crop up as people are covering this story. And I guess we've already talked a little bit about it, and I hope you can help us understand the reason why Putin would actually invade Ukraine at this particular point. Is it just to reinstitute the Soviet Empire? Or?
Not the Soviet Empire, because again, I don't think that he is a communist in any real sense of the word. He did describe the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, whereas most people living in that part of the world regarded it as the greatest geopolitical triumph of the 20th century. And of course, the East, and I put that generally, think of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Bulgaria, all those countries fled west. So people talk about the expansion of NATO to the East as if there's some kind of malicious plan. No, it's the East fled west. That's the direction people went. Nobody was forced to join NATO. In fact, I wish they'd forced Ukraine to join NATO. Most Ukrainians now wish they'd joined NATO. They had the pathway to NATO established in 2008, and they didn't follow it for a variety of reasons. But no, Putin's agenda is really to reconstitute some kind of Russian-dominated imperium, I'll call it. Empire is a little strong as a word, but his victory speech was actually leaked, and so we actually got it. And if you read what he wrote about the supposed historical unity of Ukrainians and Russians some months ago, and then you read his victory speech, which of course he hasn't delivered because he hasn't won a victory, but it came out, and in it he has this vision of a Russian-dominated territory that would include Belarus, which has become basically his vassal state already under Lukashenko, another war criminal. And he's trying to occupy and control Ukraine. So he would bring Russia with, of course, its Siberian reserves and resources. That's a remarkable piece of territory, 6th of the Earth's land surface. That's Russia. And then you add Belarus and you add Ukraine, you become a pretty strong power, right? Without Ukraine, Russia will never be a major power. It can have all the nukes it wants, but its GDP is same as Italy's, right? So it's not a great power, and it's very dependent on the sale of oil and natural gas, and of course that's being slowly ramped down. It's losing its ability to connect with the rest of the world. The Russian nation is being punished, frankly, for the crimes of Putin, but most polls that I've been reading say that Russians still support him, 65 to 70%. So if they support their equivalent of Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin, well, then they get what they deserve. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that there are probably innocent Russians who are going to suffer as a result of the Putin regime. But, until they have a real Russian revolution, instead of all the fake ones they've had, they got what they deserved.
How much control does he actually have of his own government?
Well, quite a lot, because the media is essentially, there's nothing like a free media there. Journalists, as you know, have been murdered or forced to flee into exile. Dissidents have been forced to flee into exile or are jailed, think on Navalny, or are murdered when they're abroad. The oligarchs who have enriched themselves at Putin's, with his permission, in effect, are not going to challenge him. By and large, one or two might say a few words, but they depend on his largesse to maintain their grotesque wealth. So there's really not much of an internal opposition. I know there have been protests and there have been brave people coming out on the streets, but you can count those in the thousands, right? There are 140 million Russians. So we haven't seen 1 million Russians on the streets. Whereas if you remember 2014, or before that, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, but 2014, the Revolution of Dignity or the Euromaidan Revolution, millions of Ukrainians came out on the streets to protest Yanukovych's regime and how it tried to tilt back toward Moscow. And he fled and went to Russia and became a Russian citizen. You haven't heard a word from him. You'd think that a former president of Ukraine would be saying, stop this war, zip, quiet. And meanwhile, sympathy for Ukraine, yes, because first of all, Ukrainians have been independent for 30 years. So there's that generation that I talked about a moment ago that are going to fight for their freedom. But there's also a remarkable man, and that is, of course, Lubomyr Luciuk. Who could have guessed? I've actually told people he should be Time Man of the Year. He should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He should be made an honorary citizen of Canada, like Nelson Mandela, people like that, because here is a man who was offered safety by the United States. The Americans said, we'll fly out of here. Take your parents, your children, your wife, get you out of here. You'll be safe in Washington. And you know what he said? He said, I don't need transportation. I need ammunition.
Yeah.
Like, he's a Churchill equivalent.
My next question was going to be, Zelensky, right man, right time, right place.
Zelensky, remarkable man at the wrong time, but certainly in the right place.
Yeah.
The last I saw of him, he's still in Kyiv with most of his immediate entourage. He has quite properly pointed out that Putin's propaganda about how Ukraine's run by Nazis and neo-fascists and all this stuff. I mean, talk about the pot calling the kettle black. I mean, Putin's the fascist. Well, Zelensky's Jewish. The Minister of Defense is Jewish. Ukrainians overwhelmingly voted him in, like 70-something%, I forget, 73%, I think it was. So here we have, a man whose father fought in the Red Army against the Nazis, as opposed to a man whose father, fought against the Nazis, but also held up Joseph Stalin. A man whose son admires Joseph Stalin, whose grandfather served Joseph Stalin, calling Volodymyr Zelensky, the head of a Nazi clique. I mean, it's just the world has laughed that off, but it was a very carefully constructed Soviet era bit of propaganda. The Ukrainians were all collaborators, Nazis and all that kind of stuff. And, engineered the Holocaust or helped it, along. I mean, all that stuff, some of it's based in reality. Of course, there were traitors and bad elements in every country in occupied Europe during the Second World War. Ukraine's not unique in that way. But that trope, that Soviet era Russian regurgitated thing about Nazis has been disproven. The notion that there was some kind of genocide going against Russian-speaking people in southeastern Ukraine, that's another thing that Putin said. I mean, that's nonsense. You're a journalist. You're aware of the world. Do you remember any fighting occurring in Luhansk or the Donbass more generally in January of 2014? No, there was nothing. There was no news there. I was there. People spoke Russian. Did I like it? No, but you know what? They grew up that way. Who cares? Who cares? Yeah. Ukraine said, well, we need to have a national language law. You're living in Ukraine, you should speak Ukrainian. Well, that kind of makes sense. I mean, people in France speak French. I mean, there are all sorts of other people speak many different languages, but French is the official language of France. Why wouldn't it be? Canada has a bilingual country. We're a bilingual country. We have English and French. Good. Germany, there's a national language. It's called German. So why should Ukraine be any different? Why should the Russian Federation have Russian as a national language, but then tell Ukraine, well, you have to have, a bilingual country? That's not their business. But there was no discrimination. There was no genocide occurring. What's happening now, though, is a genocide because Mr. Putin is, to go back to something you asked me about a moment ago, Putin has said very clearly, I'm going to erase Ukraine from the map of the world. So that atlas I own over there might be a collector's item after a while, if he succeeds. I mean, how can anyone in the 21st century say, I am going to erase a country? That's called genocide. And he has a genocidal agenda. He wants to erase Ukraine from the maps of the world. He pretends Ukrainians don't exist. He's taking us back to what I experienced when we started this interview as a little boy. There is no Ukraine. Where is it on the maps? So I've lived to see Ukraine become a normal country in Europe. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, Dave. Absolutely not. Look what we just witnessed in Canada a few weeks ago. Is Canada perfect? Is the United States perfect? Remember who was in charge there a year or so ago? I mean, every country has its warts. Come on, we're humans. Whether it's original sin or just our stupidity, we'll leave to the philosophers and the theologians to worry about. But in my view, in my life, I've seen Ukraine become a normal place. Students from Ukraine studying at Queen's, students from Ukraine studying the Sorbonne, people from Ukraine as tourists in Turkey, people visiting the Mediterranean, in Paris, fashion world, painters, artists, writers, all over the place. Perfectly normal people making all the normal mistakes that we all make. That was wonderful. Ukraine and Europe, that's where its people want to be. They want to be part of the European community. You heard Zelensky speaking about that. They now overwhelmingly want to be part of NATO and should have been part of NATO. It's different. Though this event, this war, let's call it the war that began on the 24th of February, has forever changed Europe, has forever changed the world. And frankly, I think its consequences will be more consequential than 9/11. Because the security structures, the architecture of post-Second World War Europe has been destroyed. And if Ukraine is allowed to fall, I'm really worried about what will happen next. Putin's lost the war in the sense that he'll never put Humpty Dumpty back together again. This is not going to be some kind of Russian imperium. Ukrainians are all going to be sitting there going, okay, well, we're all right. We're Russian now. That's not going to happen. That split it's irrevocable. But what will Ukrainians think the day after the war ends when they look at Western support? Yes, they gave us some weapons, finally, reluctantly. You remember, for a few weeks, there was like, oh, well, we can give them blankets, we can give them helmets, we can give them, night vision goggles, we can send them some Band-Aids, but we're not going to put boots on the ground. We're not going to have a no-fly zone. We're not even going to have corridors where people can escape the fighting. Ukrainians are fighting and dying and fleeing, doing all the things that happen to people in war. And I think when it's all over, some of them are going to say, whose side are we really on? They won't be on Russia's side, but they might look around the world and say, where else can we develop relationships, alliances, so that this never happens again? Mm-hmm. I see People's Republic of China sitting back going, this is convenient for the Belt and Road Initiative. China has already extensive ties with Ukraine. I can see them saying, after the Russians have taught them a lesson, quote unquote, after the Ukrainians have resisted and learned something, maybe they'll look to us. Because, quite frankly, President Biden, as much as the State of the Union, he said all the right things, but he didn't do much about it.
One of the things I think we should advise listeners is that we are recording this on March 10th. And this is a situation that's very fluid. It's constantly changing. A lot is happening. But as of the 10th of March, 2022, a couple of sort of political questions, if I may, just short little answers, if you wouldn't mind. And that's the business of Zelensky. He is confirming that he is going to stay in his bunker. Do you anticipate that at some particular point he may leave that to get away so that he can run a government in exile? Is that politically the way to go, or does he stay there till the end?
I think from what I've heard him say, he will stay there to the end.
Okay. All right. One of the issues with respect to the no-fly zone that we talked about, so that's putting NATO planes in the air to ward off Russian planes that are dropping bombs on Ukraine. And the concern is that this becomes a wider war if NATO puts planes in the air. And the concern, if you take that a little further, that if you back Putin into a corner, that he'll start pushing those buttons. Right. And I'm wondering if you have any particular views on that.
I do. I think the notion that Putin will start World War III, to put it that way, if the West takes more vigorous steps to protect Ukraine, basically caters to this bully. He has pushed every button already, and the West has caved every time. We remember that just a few weeks ago, the West was not going to provide any so-called lethal weaponry. It has since. What did Putin do? Did he stop? No. Did he escalate to nuclear war? No. He's the guy in the schoolyard who says, give me your lunch money or I'll beat you up. And you give him the lunch money, and the next day he comes back and says, give me your lunch money and your lunch. And then the next day he says, give me your lunch money, your lunch, and your brand new sneakers. And if you don't get together with 2 or 3 other people and deal with the bully and say, you might get 1 or 2 of us, but in the end, we're going to get you, you never win. Ukraine has gone to the United Nations and said, look what the Russian Federation is doing to a founding member of the UN, Ukraine. The UN has condemned Russian aggression, properly so, but so what? Hasn't done anything about it. The Ukraine has gone to the international court and said war crimes. The Russians didn't even bother to show up. Ukraine has done everything it can to alert the world to the war crimes and atrocities being perpetrated. And the world, there's lots of sympathy. I mean, you and I see it in Kingston with donations to the mayor's fund, with the city hall being blue and yellow at night, all this kind of stuff. There's all sorts of diffuse sympathy for Ukraine. People call, the phone's been going off the hook, as you can imagine, with people offering to provide housing for refugees or employment and all the rest of it. But the point is, Ukrainians don't want to give up their country. And I think to say that, if the West steps in, Putin will launch World War III. Well, first of all, you've got to assume that the military chain of command in Russia is suicidal, because anybody, who pushes that button is dead. I don't think Putin enjoys widespread real support among the military. Again, they know they cannot defeat NATO. They can't. It's, again, Russia's GDP is that of Italy's, and there are 30 countries in NATO. So do you really think that with the United States, which has got, trillions more per year than all of Russia, that Russia could win such a war? And do you think that the Russian military doesn't know that? Now, they're patriots. If NATO invaded Russia, that'd be something quite different. But NATO is a defensive alliance. They have no intention of invading Russia. What they can do is deter Russia from perpetrating massacres. Now, that certainly isn't likely going to happen. I don't think NATO is going to establish a no-fly zone over all of Ukraine. That would be a big undertaking. They could potentially establish no-fly zones over corridors to allow civilian population to evacuate. That would be largely women and children, with the men staying behind to fight. That we've already seen. They could allow for some of their East European country members of NATO to turn over military equipment to Ukrainians who can use it. We've heard about the MiG-29s and so on that are sitting around in Romania and Poland that can be flown by Ukrainian pilots. Give it over. Give them more military hardware, the anti-aircraft missiles and things. They can do a lot of that. I mean, they've been doing that, and Putin hasn't pushed a button. So I think it's a bit of a bluff. I don't think Putin's military chain of command supports him as entirely as he thinks. They're seeing their defeat. It's not going anywhere for them. So why would you escalate and launch a tactical nuclear weapon? So you would be the first country in the world after the United States to drop the bomb, as we would put it, on another country. The world can't tolerate that. Now, I have to tell you, and I don't know if you're aware of this, Dave, back on the 15th of November, 1991, I wrote a piece that was in the Globe and Mail where I cautioned the Ukrainians about accepting any deal where they would give up their nuclear weapons in return for guarantees of their political independence and territorial integrity. I said, that's a foolish thing to do. They called me a warmonger then. Then they had the Budapest Memorandum, where they got the assurances of the United Kingdom and the United States and of the Russian Federation that if they gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world at the time, their integrity would be protected or agreed. Well, how'd that play out for you? I was surprised that just the other day, the Globe and Mail editorialized on the no-fly zone, said we shouldn't do it because it could provoke a war. And then at the bottom of that column, they actually wrote, gee, I wonder if Ukraine had kept its nuclear weapons, whether that would have been a deterrent to Putin now. Well, that's North Korea. It's doing pretty well, quote unquote, because it's a nuclear power and everybody's afraid to go in there, right? To get rid of an odious dictator who's, as big a thug in a junior league as Putin is in a major league. Nuclear weapons are horrible things, but they seem to have some functional value. Ask Israel, ask Pakistan. It works for them. So I think it's a bluff. I think it's unfortunate that Ukraine did not remain a nuclear power. I also think that this notion of Article 5 and NATO, one for all and all for one stuff, really, are you feeling safe in Estonia today, my fellow Estonians? Is NATO going to go to war as I pointed out in a letter to the editor in the Globe yesterday, is NATO going to go to war for Montenegro? Really? Really? You think so? So if they're prepared to give up a country of 44 million people, say, here's the NATO wall, and unfortunately, folks, you Ukrainians, you're on the wrong side of the wall. Here's some guns, here's some blankets, here's some help. Good luck. If they're prepared to let Putin slaughter, perpetuate a genocide against the Ukrainian nation, which is what he's intent on doing, I genuinely believe. If they allow that to happen, I sure wouldn't want to be sitting around, even in Poland, counting on, Article 5. Mm-hmm. Look at how long it took the Germans to get off their behinds. The richest country in Europe, the leaders of Europe, they did change their policy, and now they've ramped up their defense spending. Now they're providing lethal weaponry to Ukraine, supposedly, although it seems to be taking an awful long time to get there. But France is still kind of ambivalent. The Brits, somewhat to my surprise, now that they're out of the European Union, were among the best in terms of going quickly to the aid of Ukraine. Boris Johnson has his faults, but not on this file. Not on this file, as compared to the leaders of Germany or France or some of the other countries. Most of the world has seen a Europe populated by Chamberlains, by appeasers, as compared to Zelensky, who's the Churchill of our time.
Question about Putin.
Yeah.
Some people have thought that he is starting to deteriorate mentally, that he's doing things that don't make a lot of sense. Given where we are on March 10th, 2022, does he survive this in terms of being leader of Russia? Or does he get replaced? Or does it depend on what happens?
Well, he's lost the war in every true sense of, the war being lost. That won't be forgotten by his immediate entourage or by the people who he is. I won't say he's beholden to them, but I mean, it's a circle. It's a small circle of very wealthy people who together with him have maintained power over the Russian nation and have bled it white. I mean, the average Russian doesn't live anywhere near like Putin lives, trust me. So the Russian nation has been bled to the benefit of the corrupt criminals around Putin. He's ventured on this war, and a lot of them have been obviously reluctant about it. They have been, yes, we're with you, but they're not happy. They're suffering economic consequences now, and of course, probably cultural ones as well. I'm not sure Putin will survive this, and I certainly hope he doesn't survive this. I mean, I'm a person of some faith, but in this case, I'll say without any hesitation, I pray that he dies every day. Mm-hmm. And if someone puts a bullet in his head, that's perfectly fine by me. I mean, I don't see any evil in killing a Hitler or a Stalin or a Mao or a Putin. That said, he has a fairly strong grip on Russian society in terms of controlling the media, controlling the oligarchs, controlling the opposition, controlling the Russian Orthodox Church, which has basically become a tool of the KGB. And don't forget that his closest confederates are like him. He's a secret policeman. He's in the KGB, or was in the KGB. He elevated many of the men and women, mainly men, that he worked with as a secret policeman to positions of power and rewarded them. So he's got people who are truly beholden to him for their wealth, for their prestige, for their power, for their influence. And if he goes, they go. So again, it's like, you don't have, obviously, we all can't stomach the notion of a Hitler. But you'll notice that when Hitler went down, so did Joseph Goebbels, right? The people around him know that there's no way out for them.
Yeah.
You think Lavrov is going to be what? The next Russian foreign minister after this is all over? If Putin goes? No, he's gone. He's a war criminal too. So the people who have condoned Putin's behavior, who have stepped by and done nothing, these are people who are going to stay with him, I think, to the bitter end. Just like Zelensky has a cabinet that is staying with him in Kyiv and may die with him in Kyiv because they will say, this is our sacred duty to the nation, to Ukraine. I mean, to say, Zelensky is a Churchill. Putin is Putler, as some Ukrainians call him, is the Hitler of our time. And there are all these appeasers around who caution, we can't have a no-fly zone, we can't have corridors, we can't give them this weapon or that weapon because, we're afraid. Well, yeah, I'm afraid too. I don't want to see a single one of my cadets die in Eastern Europe defending Ukraine. I really don't, even if they are of Ukrainian heritage. I don't think we need to do that. I think if we properly equip the Ukrainians themselves, they will defend their homeland. But we can't sort of promise them things and not deliver. We can't just say, good luck. Ukraine is at the gates of Europe. Ukraine is defending European civilization. Ukraine is already fighting World War III. We've got to step up to the plate. We cannot appease Mr. Putin. If we do that, who's next?
Mm-hmm. Let's wrap up by bringing it back home to talk a little bit. We have a few minutes left to talk about the support that the community is giving to Ukrainian students who are studying at Queen's and St. Lawrence College. And this is an initiative that was started, a few days ago now. And already it's become very successful. Yeah.
About 2 weeks ago when the war began, the 24th of February, I was woken up by a call from Ukraine and told about the war. Quite frankly, I was shocked that Mr. Putin had actually launched a full-scale invasion. And after I'd sort of thought about my parents and how they'd feel and frankly cried a little, I got thinking about what can we do? So of course, many Canadians are contributing to the International Red Cross. Unfortunately, a lot of those supplies that are being sent are being warehoused in the bordering countries and the Ukrainians can't get to them. So there are organizations like the Ukrainian Canadian Congress or the Canada-Ukraine Foundation, registered charities that are actually getting relief supplies into Ukraine, which is where they're needed. So all that's good, however you want to contribute through the United Nations or Red Cross or Ukrainian Canadian organizations, it's all good. But what are we doing, I thought to myself, for Ukrainian students who are in Kingston at St. Lawrence College or at Queen's? Students who have suddenly found themselves cut off from their families and loved ones, from their country, from their bank accounts, perhaps in some cases, who can't get home now, who don't know perhaps where their parents or brothers or sisters or lovers are. So, Sophie Kowala, to her great credit, called me up, said, we've got about 13, 14 Ukrainian students here at St. Lawrence College. I had, of course, contacts with the Queen's University Ukrainian Students Club. Years ago, I was the president of it. I'm still pleased to see there is a club there. Got in touch with them and said, are there students from Ukraine who are members of your club? Yes, there are. So 2 weeks ago on a Monday evening, we brought together about 70 students in a room at Queen's, Kingston Hall. And we launched the Mayor's Fund for Students from Ukraine in Kingston. So thanks to the patronage of Brian Patterson, my colleague at RMC and good friend and a great mayor of the city, under his imprimatur, we established this fund. And the idea is that while it's wonderful to give aid to Ukraine and the refugees who are coming to Canada and so on, we have people right here in our own community that we can help at Queen's and St. Lawrence. So we started the fund. It's a fund that's been established through the Kingston Community Credit Union. So there's, a branch down in Market Square. There's one in the West End, one on Division Street. So through a credit union, we're working and we're asking people to donate money, not goods, not services, not promises of housing. All of that can come later. Right now, for the short-term needs of Ukrainian students, we've established a fund that will literally give them money so that they can pay their rent, buy groceries, pay tuition, whatever they need. I mean, their student visas or work visas have been extended, so that's a good thing that the federal government did. We've had the support of Mark Gerritsen, we've had the support of Ian Arthur and the mayor. So, this is nonpartisan. The whole idea is gather some money together, meet with the students about every 2 weeks, and ask them, okay, what do you need? What do you need this money for? There's a committee, the Beth Israel Synagogue community, the Ukrainian Canadian Club of Kingston, a student from Queen's, a student from St. Lawrence, people from St. Lawrence and Queen's are having will constitute a subcommittee. There's a Facebook page already established. The money will literally be raised and then doled out very quickly with the minimum amount of paperwork, just so that we can get money into students' hands and help them. I'm very pleased that this fund only started. It took us about a week to get the paperwork done for the bank account. But since last Friday, when the bank account was established at the credit union, we've raised about $20,000. So thank you, Kingston, and thank you all the people who are trying to help. We can use more, and I assure your listeners that every single penny will go to a student from Ukraine. There are no administrative costs. We are not, this is all volunteer work. I'm really grateful to the Beth Israel Synagogue. I'm grateful to Mayor Patterson, to Mark Gerritsen, Ian Arthur. Again, you can see that we're working with people from Queens, St. Lawrence, students, administrators. Everyone is pitching in, everyone. And I rarely say this because I'm thinking, boy, can I actually say that? And the reality of it is, yeah, everyone's been wonderful. You know what? Everyone has been wonderful. There's always bumps, bureaucracy and paperwork and all this kind of stuff. But the reality of it is, I am so heartened by the generosity, by the spirit of cooperation. Beth Israel Synagogue, the Archdiocese of Kingston, Father Sean, all these people have come and said, how can we help? How can we give? How can we sustain, succor these students who find themselves in need? How can we help Ukraine? I mean, literally, as you started off the program, the phone is, the calls for interviews, the calls for information, the calls for advice haven't stopped since February 24th. I'm on leave for various reasons, and I thought I'd have time to just sort of recuperate and rest a bit. Thanks a lot, Mr. Putin.
That ain't going to happen.
Yeah. Then Putin happened. It's, but the truth is, good people have come together, as they did for my parents in their time, and are helping Ukrainian refugees, as they did for my parents' time. And I never thought, Dave, when I was a boy growing up, when we went to Rigi, or I went to Queens, that someday not only would I be writing about Ukraine, all that, so that's an academic career, that's interesting stuff, but that's academic. I never thought that at the, in the winter of my life, or whatever you want to call it, that this old lion would be going, now it's my turn to help refugees from Ukraine, people cut off by war, victims of the war, people suffering these traumas. Just like Kingstonians helped my parents, and then my parents came, raised my sister and me, Lydia and I, and now I'm helping refugees. I mean, it says a lot about Canada, it says a lot about the world, unfortunately, but it really is good news. If I can use that expression in the Lenten season, the liturgical calendar, we're coming up to Easter soon. And by the way, we're going to have some kind of special occasion, some kind of meal, traditional meal for all these Ukrainian students at Easter to make them feel welcome and at home. I know how hard it would be for me if I were cut off from my family at that time of year. And so we're going to make every effort to, again, over the next couple of months, sustain these students in Kingston until things hopefully clarify and hopefully Ukraine wins its war, its just war against Russian imperialism.
I appreciate all the time you've given us today and learned a lot. And hopefully, as you say, this gets resolved to the benefit of Ukraine in the not too distant future with a minimal loss of life, which seems to be catastrophic right now. And hopefully things will improve and we can get things dealt with in a much better way. So thank you very much for all your time. All the best.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Pray for Ukraine. Thank you.
And Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava.
Thanks again to my guest, Lubomyr Luciuk. For more information on that local fundraiser, please go to Facebook and seek out the Mayor's Fund for Students from Ukraine. This episode was recorded virtually on March 10th, 2022.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast at gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.